wait another minute, no, I won't. I'm a man on a mission. I'm a man on a mission. I don't need no permission. I'm a man on a mission. Take it up now, take it up. I ain't waiting and wishing. Take it up now, take it up. Oh, I got that ambition. Take it up now, take it up. I'm a man on a mission. Won't wait another minute, no, I won't. I won't wait another minute, no, I won't. I won't wait another minute, no, I won't, yeah. I won't wait another minute, no, I won't. I'm a man on a mission. I'm a man on a mission. I don't need no permission. I'm a man on a mission. Take it up now, take it up. I ain't waiting and wishing. Take it up now, take it up. Oh, I got that ambition. Take it up now, take it up. I'm a man on a mission. Take it up now, take it up. Take it up now, take it up. Take it up now, take it up. I'm a mission.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Marine Mammals of Sri Lanka, a whale watching guide webinar. This is the 9th online lecture that we, the Wildlife Society of St. Thomas's College, Mount Lavinia, have conducted so far. The goal of these online webinars are to raise awareness among the public on Sri Lanka's unique flora and fauna, as we believe that awareness is a vital component of conservation. For those of you who don't know, the Wildlife Society of St. Thomas's College, Mount Lavinia is one of the oldest and longest surviving natural history clubs in the country. Being founded in 1884, our society has empowered many great naturalists, scientists, and conservationists for over 138 years. Today, we are extremely honored and delighted to present to you Mr. Gehan de Silva Wijeyeratne. Mr. Gehan is one of Sri Lanka's leading wildlife authors and nature photographers, having written on multiple taxa, including land and marine mammals, birds, dragonflies, butterflies, and plants. His books have been published by leading international publishers, including Brack, Bloomsbury, New Holland, and John Beaufoy Publishing. Mr. Gehan's contribution toward wildlife tourism is unlike any other. He has brought much publicity to Sri Lanka as a wildlife destination internationally by presenting our island as the best location to observe blue whales, leopards, and Asian elephants. He has also spotlighted major natural history events like the mega sperm whale gathering off the coast of Sri Lanka and the great elephant gathering off Minneria and Kaudula National Parks on a global scale. We are extremely honored to have Mr. Gehan speak to us today. Now, I would like to sincerely thank Jeep and Demo Sri Lanka for sponsoring this webinar. We are ever grateful for their generous contribution towards this initiative. I would also like to thank the ICT Society of St. Thomas's College, Mount Lavinia, who worked tirelessly to live stream this event on YouTube. So if you have any questions that you wish to get answered by Mr. Gehan regarding the topic, please send them in the chat to me. So I'm a co-host and Jonathan Bulatsingros. If you have any questions, you can just send them in the chat to me. And if you're watching off YouTube live, please send your questions to the comment section. So without a further ado, I would like to hand it to Mr. Gehan. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, and good morning and good afternoon to wherever you are. It's an honor and a privilege to be invited by the St. Thomas's College Natural History Society to give this presentation. So let me start by doing a screen share and making sure that the tech is working. Okay, I presume everybody can Okay, I hope everybody can see everything. Okay, so I'm going to talk through a number of things. The point I would make is that there is an emphasis on the whale watching side rather than this being a scientific presentation. I just want to get across the point how good Sri Lanka is for marine mammals and how it's very good for certain iconic species. I have a lot of slides to get through, so you're going to find that I'm going to get through the slides at rocket speed. I've structured this into 7 sections. And I'd like to start with some preliminaries. I appreciate most of you who've joined the call live are from Sri Lanka, but for the benefit of anybody who tunes in, I will provide some context. But first, I'd like to say a big thank you to the various individuals, corporate supporters, and publishers who have supported my work over the years. I could easily spend an hour just talking about that. So let's begin with the physical context for Sri Lanka. So we know we are on the equator. It's very easy to assume that if you're in the tropics, it means it's going to be lush and tropical. But if you look to the west, towards the Horn of Africa and the Arabian Peninsula, you can see that other countries which are close to the equator are not lush and full of biodiversity. And the reason for this is very large scale, planetary scale factors, such as the oceanic currents and the air streams that dictate and drive things like the monsoons. So Sri Lanka has a very interesting topographical structure because we've got mountains in the middle. We've got 2 monsoons, the northeast and the southwest, blowing across each other diagonally. And this means across a fairly sort of moderately sized island of 60,000 square kilometers, we have a varied climatic structure from the perhumid or permanently humid wet zone in the west to the dry zone in the northeast and the southeast, and some arid zones as well. Now, what causes this is the rain shadow from India. So if you look at how Sri Lanka is positioned, if you imagine the rains coming from the west, the Western Ghats creates a rain shadow, and where the Western Ghats meets those incoming winds, a lot of the moisture is shed, which is what creates a dry zone. And in fact, there's a double effect because we also have our own mountains, further water is shed on those mountains, which means the east is relatively dry. You see the same kind of effect even in an island like Britain, where the west is wetter because there's high ground on the west, although they don't have mountains on the scale of Sri Lanka. So this creates a very varied structure, very high in endemism. And there's also a lot of nutrient flow as a result to the seas, which creates a sort of a good buffet for the marine mammals. So in this slide, I'm just trying to make the point that in the graph on the left, what I'm saying is if you imagine that as the size of the land area increases, you're going to have more species. You will see something like the graph on the left. But if the number of species per unit area is roughly the same, then you will see something like a graph on the right, where you'll have a horizontal line with dots for the individual countries. And if you compare like with like, so you're not comparing Britain which is in a temperate climate, with Sri Lanka, but if you compare Sri Lanka with other large tropical islands like Madagascar, Borneo, and New Guinea, you might expect to see that the species per unit area is roughly the same. But you might think Sri Lanka may be a little lower because it's a smaller island and there could be more leakage of species. But when you look at this graph, the red line, which really jumps up well above the rest, is Sri Lanka. So you can see that we are punching above our weight, and Sri Lanka is unexpectedly high in terms of the species per unit area. So there's no doubt that large tropical islands like New Guinea and Borneo, Madagascar, which are 10 times bigger than Sri Lanka, will have more species. But in terms of the species density, we are very high and we have lots of endemics. Now, I'm not going to read through everything. but here I've outlined some of the factors that result in this. The physical factors, the evolutionary factors, and the human factors are important in terms of making it very good for Sri Lanka being a big game safari destination. There's more details on a 24-page PDF, and if you search Google for why Sri Lanka is super rich for wildlife, you'll come across this and you'll have more details on that. Because of my interest in tourism, I just want to also point out that there are other countries which are definitely better. So for big game, East Africa and South Africa will be better. The rainforests in the neotropics are richer, and places like Borneo and New Guinea have vast areas of rainforest. You might argue that the whale watching is better in the US and so on. But if you take all the key factors for tourism, and you might find that Sri Lanka is exceptional as a wildlife destination. And in fact, I've made the case that as an all-round wildlife destination, Sri Lanka has a case for being treated as the best. So moving on to part 3, let's move on to the whale watching. So in the early years, I'm sorry that the slides are jumping through a bit. There's, for some reason, when I'm screen sharing, I'm having a little technical issue. So let's just take a recap on the marine mammals. So when we talk about marine mammals, I think people usually think of things like the whales and dolphins, but you also have what are called the sirenians, like the dugong. And then you have things like the seals, which you don't usually get in Sri Lanka, although we did have one juvenile southern elephant seal turning up recently. So if you look at the cetaceans, which is in the middle of the slide, there are 90 species in the world. Sri Lanka has 27. So Sri Lanka has a third, but it would be misleading to say that you can see a third of the whales and dolphins of the world around Sri Lanka. Most of them are very rare. But where Sri Lanka scores is we are very good for a few iconic species like the blue whale and the sperm whale. So the blue whale is the largest animal that has ever lived on the planet. We tend to think that it must be the dinosaurs that were the biggest things that ever lived, but actually it isn't. It's the blue whale. And this was a very, very difficult animal to see until it became publicized from around May 2008 that Sri Lanka was the best in the world for seeing the blue whale. The largest toothed carnivore in the world is the sperm whale. And the largest superpods that you can see on a whale watch are again from Sri Lanka. So here's the full list again, and I've bold-faced the ones you're more likely to see: bride's whale, blue whale, sperm whale, killer whale, pan-tropical spotted dolphin, striped spinner, Indo-Pacific bottlenose, short-fin pilot whale, rhesus, false killer whale. So the list is not huge, but we have a very good encounter rate, which I will come on to later. So if you're going whale watching, where are the places you would focus on? So we have Kalpitia on the northwest, and it's a peninsula that sticks out, and that peninsula takes you close to the continental shelf. It's very good for dolphins, and you also have whales, especially the superpods of sperm whales coming in close. Trincomalee has a submarine canyon, so the deep water brings the whales in, and you can see them quite often from the shore. And in the south, around Dondra, the continental shelf pinches in. And again, it means that you're close to where you have this turbulence, where the depth change takes place, close to shore. There's a lot of churning of currents and a lot of organic nutrients come up, and there's a rich food chain developing, and it's very good for whales. So Mirissa is in the south. With the expressway, you can be down in an hour and a half from Colombo. And in the early days, I used to engage a lot with tour operators and media, both sort of print journalists as well as film crews. And it was very important in terms of developing the whale watching industry to come up with credible numbers and not just say, oh, you heard that, or you heard of somebody who's seen a blue whale, but to go out there and see it and collect data to make a credible case. So what I've done here is I've taken the whale watching data principally from Marisa Water Sports. So there's 1,183 sailings in this early set of data. And I've counted the number of times that either a whale or dolphin was seen. And so you can see that the whale watching efficiency is 98%. So that's phenomenal. There aren't very many places in the world that have this kind of efficiency. And interestingly, a lot of this is driven by blue whale encounters. If it was just dolphins, it may not be that exciting because there are places in the world with a good whale watching efficiency during the peak season. In this, I looked at the blue whale sightings from a smaller data set. Now, again, this data only runs in the first few years because it was in those early years that I had to convince the journalists that Sri Lanka was good for seeing blue whales. Now everybody knows it, so I don't really have to push that so hard. In fact, if at all, the problem is that it's too well known and there are too many boats going out, but that's another problem which needs its own set of solutions. So in this, what I did was I took the best month, but sometimes this data could be flawed because you could have gone out 5 times and seen blue whales each of those times. So that's 100% encounter rate. So I said, let's look at the second best month for a year and the third best month for the year. So that's the red line in the bottom graph. So even the third best month was still showing an encounter rate of 80%. And presenting this kind of information was very important to convince tour operators that this is a viable product, that you can brand Sri Lanka as a whale watching destination. It was also important for film crews who didn't want to spend a lot of time and money coming out if the chance of seeing and filming was very remote. But when you presented information like this, they were more convinced. There's about 33 articles I have placed online, so for anybody who wants more information, you can look them up. I know I'm going through the slides at the rate of knots, but as this is recorded, you can always, I guess, look at the recording and hit the pause button and look up the links and find more information. So in part 4, I just want to drill home the distinction between what are called baleen whales and what are called toothed whales. And when I first went out whale watching to see if there's, to sort of validate some of what Charles Anderson had come and seen and told me about, and I was looking at it from a tourism perspective. So one of the things I realized was that at that time, so little was known, people didn't even know the difference between a blue whale and a sperm whale. So at the level of scientific orders, or more correctly, PAV orders, the whales fall into 2 groups, what are called the baleen whales or mysticetes, or the toothed whales or the odontocetes. One of the key distinctions is that the baleen whales have 2 blowholes, and you can see that in this picture. And from some of the whale watching boats which have a high deck, when the whales surface and soon after they made a blow and the mist is subsided, you can see this. Whereas the toothed whales, like the sperm whale, just has only 1. The other obvious distinction is that the toothed whales have teeth and the baleen whales have what are called sheets of baleen. So, and so they use these as filters to filter the water through and take in the rich zooplankton and the phytoplankton, as well as small fishes. So here are some sort of pictures from an aerial perspective, again showing the 2 blowholes. So you can see here, this blue whale has got both blowholes open. And here's this underwater photograph from Tony Vu that shows blowholes close when it dives down. So it's like a submarine closing the hatch when it goes down. Whereas with things like the spinner dolphins, you can see it's just got 1 blowhole. And in the sperm whale, again, there's just 1 blowhole. And in the sperm whale, it's pointing to a side. This picture also shows the flaking skin on the sperm whale, which is quite useful for scientists who are studying DNA because they can just scoop this up from the water and do their DNA analysis without needing any intrusive method to extract the DNA. So let's look at what kind of things you look for when you're out in the field and you're trying to identify species. So let's look at a very easy example of the distinction between the blue whale and the sperm whale. And remember, in the early days, even the fishing crews, because they didn't really pay any attention to the whales, every whale was a whale, and if they would see a sperm whale, they would claim it was a blue whale if that's what you were out looking for. So the fin shape is not always diagnostic, and you'll find like the blue whale's fin and the humpback whale's fin looks the same. But amongst some species, you can use the fin shape as a very easy diagnostic to tell them apart, like with the blue whale and the sperm whale. So you can see the sperm whale has a nice sort of curved conical hump. The blue whale is much more stubby. You see the blue whale having a bit of plain mottling on the skin, which the sperm whale doesn't have. The tail shape is a good one to look for. So the blue whale, it's triangular and the trailing edge is slightly concave and with a slight notch. Notice the sperm whale, it's a narrow triangle, but rounded, and it's much more deeply notched here. And sometimes all you might photograph is this tail fluke disappearing into the water, but that's enough to identify the species. So it's not like with birds where if all you caught is a glimpse of the tail, that's enough to identify. The shape is also very different. So you can see the blue whale is sort of nice and smooth. The sperm whale feels like, like when you washed a sock and when you squeezed it dry and it's all a bit wrinkly. And it's got this sort of serrated finish at the top. And the body shape, the blue whale looks more rounded, and the sperm whale is sort of longer and uneven. But be careful, because different viewing angles means that they can look very different, as you can see in this picture. So in the top, it looks very sort of sausage shape, whereas in the one below, the profile looks very different. There are a few other giveaway clues between the blue whales and the sperm whales, and one is that the blue whales have the remoras. The remoras are a kind of fish that have this very interesting sucker attachment, and the science of biomimicry is actually studying this, because you can see what nature has evolved and see whether we can develop that for applied engineering purposes. And I look forward to the day when that technology is evolved so that we can attach satellite tags to the bodies of whales using that remora technology, because that means we will be able to follow these animals around the world and learn a lot about their movements. And the blue whales have a lot of remoras because they feed typically around 40 meters of depth. They're absent from sperm whales largely, and this could be because the sperm whales dive so deep. They can dive between 1 to 3 kilometers, and the pressures at those distances are absolutely crushing. And it's probably too much of an evolutionary investment for the remoras to evolve to sort of survive at those depths. There are also behavioral differences between the blue whales here and what you see off California. The position of the remoras appear to be different, and the number of times they fluke up, that is, they bring their tail up when they dive, seems to be different. In Sri Lanka, they fluke up almost all the time, and in places like Baja, California, they do it much more rarely. So let's move on to a selection of the whales and dolphins you will see off Sri Lanka. I'm not going to try and cover all 27 species, just the ones that are more common. So as I mentioned before, there are 3 mammalian orders that contribute to the marine mammal fauna. There are about 27 orders of mammals in the world. So we have the Sirenia, and there's only one species worldwide, the dugong. Then the carnivora, you have the seals, and we have just one record of southern elephant seal. And then we have this group called the Cetatodactyla, which I will return to later, which has the whales and the dolphins. So the dugong is quite an unobtrusive animal. It's, when it surfaces, you may not even hear it or notice it. So the area around Manai is best known for it, and these mammals probably move regularly between India and Sri Lanka. It has become very rare in Sri Lanka, and occasionally an animal surfaces because it's been accidentally caught or maybe even deliberately caught, and it's been brought in the fish markets, although it's illegal. They feed on seagrass, which is in the bottom left. And these pictures from Vard and Patanka interestingly show the feeding trails that they leave on the bottom. We're all used to seeing feeding trails of animals when we go on game drives, but it's interesting to note that you pick up that kind of thing with the marine mammals as well. So the carnivora is the other scientific order which has contributed to the marine mammal fauna. This is a very familiar group. So we have the much loved sort of leopard and the sloth bear and the wolves and jackals and things that are very popular with the photographers. And we know we have an idea what a carnivore is. They've got teeth and they can give you a nasty bite. There are 3 families that have adapted to an aquatic existence, which are shaded in blue: the eared seals, the walrus, and the earless seals. And recently, we had a southern elephant seal, a juvenile, that turned up in Unuwatana, and then it was seen off Wijeyeratne, and many photographers went out and got photographs of this juvenile. They are mainly found in the subantarctic islands and off Argentina, but there are scattered records of them finding their way up towards towards tropical latitudes. The scientific order which contributes most of the marine mammals is what's now called the Cetatodactyla. And this is some interesting members, and it might surprise people to know that the whales and dolphins are in the same scientific order as the giraffes and the deer and pigs and camels. But this is based on phylogenetic analysis, molecular phylogenetic analysis. And the current thinking is that the whales actually evolved from 4-legged ungulates. And on the right-hand side, this blurry picture is a mountain mouse deer or yellow-striped chevrotain, which Nadir Ravir Singh and I photographed swimming underwater in Horton Plains to await detection by a brown mongoose that was hunting it. So we know the hippopotamuses are aquatic mammals, and they feed underwater and they can hold their breath underwater. But the mouse deer or the chevrotains do the same, but usually as an escape mechanism, not for feeding. So it's not, it's not too far-fetched to see that the molecular evidence is finding that evolutionary link. And there are quite a few families of compulsive or obligate marine mammals, and not all of these families are found in Sri Lanka. And I'll just run through a few that are. So we'll start with what's known as the rorquals. So these are the ones that really get a lot of the attention. And in Sri Lanka, we've had 4 species recorded. There are records of the fin whale, but those may be misidentifications. There also could be confusion because the fin whale, the word fin whale was also used to describe blue whale before, like, there were names like, the Indian fin whale and so on, used to refer to the blue whale. But as people become more confident with the criteria for distinguishing species, we will know in the future if a fin whale does turn up, especially if there's a stranding, we'll be able to identify it much more confidently. So the blue whale is obviously the star of the show. And we will see more blue whale pictures when I come to the surface behavior thing, so I won't dwell on it now. The other orca whale that you see often when you're whale watching in Marissa is the bride's whale. It's much more discreet in its behavior, but the whale watching crews now have become very familiar with identifying this tropical whale. And if you do get a good sort of view from top, you can see it's got 3 ridges on its rostrum, and this is quite characteristic. The fin shape is also very characteristic. It's sort of falcate or curved backwards, and it's just not stubby like with the blue whale. And most of the whale watching boats now, just one look and they can immediately tell if they've got a bride's whale in view. The humpback whale is probably as well known as the blue whale because it's a very charismatic mammal, especially when it's breaching. In Sri Lanka, it's quite rare, and this was actually photographed by Wijeyeratne when he took some Thomians out on a whale watching cruise, and they came across a mother and calf humpback whale, and they got some very good photographs. And together with a few others, we were able to work it up into a paper. So in our paper, we found that there were perhaps at the most 8 reliable recordings of the humpback whale. A lot of people claim they have seen a humpback whale because they see blue whales and sperm whales humping their backs before they dive, and they think that must be a humpback. But Ranil Nanakara, who's one of the top marine biologists in Sri Lanka, tells me he's got more records as well using acoustic methods as well. So I look forward to a paper from him where we will see more details on that. And if you did come across one, and if you find it, see it blowing, this is what the blow looks like. So it's quite similar to a blue whale blow, which is vertical. And blows are the other key field character you use when you're trying to identify whales, because quite often you might just see the blow and maybe a tail fluke, and that's it. So it's not like when you're bird watching and you look at the full bird to identify it down to species level. These are images that I've taken in the US. I don't think anybody's got very good images of Sri Lanka, but they show the features. So you can see the tail fin. It's very different to a blue whale. It's pointy at the edges and it's deeply serrated. So I was lucky with this picture because the whale watching boat in Boston didn't chase the whale to get this kind of view from behind. We were stationary. There were a few humpback whales around. One turned away from the boat and fluked up, which allowed me to get this picture. And I'll revisit this in my last slide on ethical photography. Don't chase whales and don't try to get behind them to get this charismatic tail fluke shot. Just don't disturb them. And I still don't have a good blue whale tail fluke shot because I've always insisted with the boat crews that we shouldn't approach the whale from behind. We should approach in parallel and at a distance so that we don't disturb the whale. Sometimes the blue whales do turn away from the boat, and you can get this kind of image if you're ready. I've seen it happening a few times, but I've never been sort of prepared for that to get the kind of shot that shows the tail fluke. If you get close to humpbacks, you can see these tubercles or protuberances, which are again very characteristic. They're also very famous for their long white pectoral fins, the wings as suggested in their Latin name. But quite often in the field, you don't actually see those long pectoral fins unless they breach. Then there are another 3 families which are found off Sri Lanka. So the sperm whale, it's just one species in a family on its own. Then you have the pygmy and dwarf sperm whales. They are quite discreet and fairly rare, and I think it's very difficult to see them. And then you have the even more mysterious beak whales, this family called the Ziphidae. So there are submarine canyons off the east coast of Sri Lanka. And if somebody were to spend a lot of time studying them using acoustic methods, I'm sure you'll record quite a lot of interesting, sort of data from the beak whales. But they're very rarely seen. They're amazing creatures. They can spend 2 hours without coming up to breathe. They're modified to hunt and live at great depths. And most of them are only known when there's a stranding. In fact, many species have only been described as a result of them stranding. And even some of the species recorded here have only been recorded because, a specimen has been found stranded or in a fish market. Now, in the toothed cetaceans, the star of the show is, of course, the sperm whale. Now, you might think this is a male breaching to show off to the females, but actually this is a female. And I was off Trincomalee on a boat with my wife and 2 daughters when we heard what sounded like a thunderclap. And then we saw this sperm whale breaching. And what happens is that in tropical latitudes, you have the nursery schools, so mainly the females and the young, and the male bulls visit from high latitudes. And when they do, the females get very excited, and you have all this amazing behavior taking place. So now we move on to the last family, the ocean dolphins. So Sri Lanka has quite a few species recorded, but again, as you can see from the bullface names, there's just a few that you're going to see regularly enough, and I will focus on a few of them here. The most charismatic, of course, is the orca or killer whale. I've seen on social media that there's actually a pod being seen off Mirissa now the last 2 or 3 days. So if anybody wants to go whale watching, this might be a good chance to go and see the orca. Very charismatic, the black and white pattern, the white sort of eye patch and the very large sort of paddle-shaped flippers. They fall into 3 ecotypes, the residents, offshore, and the transients. So the one you will see in Sri Lanka will be the transients. And later on, I will talk a little bit more about the Orca Project Sri Lanka. The males have these very tall vertical fins, so you can easily sex an adult male in the field. And the Orca Project Sri Lanka, which is led by Georgina Jamel, has now recorded over 39 individuals, because you can ID them individually using the facial patterns the way you do it with leopards and tigers. And interestingly, there's 2 orcas that are frequently seen together, and they've been seen off the United Arab Emirates as well. So it's interesting that these animals are moving from the northern Indian Ocean and going to the Arabian Peninsula and back again. So this is an example from Georgina's Orca Project catalog, where you have the details provided to identify each animal individually, and the sightings and the resightings, so that you can build a picture of their movements. Another whale that also hunts other whales and is therefore a killer of whales is the false killer whale. Looks all dark, blunt head, and occasionally people encounter small pods. And again, on social media, you see people sharing these pictures. One of the best ways to identify them is this sort of blunt but kinked shape in the pectoral fins, if you're lucky enough to have one surfacing. Another whale that well, these are all dolphins actually, although they're called whales. The short-fin pilot whale also suddenly turns up in small groups, and sometimes when a pod does turn up, you might find them on 2 or 3 consecutive sailings, and then they seem to move away. The mature males are quite interesting because they have this enormous fin that develops with a very broad base, and they have this sort of bulbous head. And the rhesus dolphin is another one of the dolphins you see. The older they get, the whiter they get, and their bodies are full of scarring, and they've got blunt heads. So they're quite unmistakable if you're lucky enough to see one on the sailing. The Indo-Pacific humpback dolphin, which I sort of popularize as the pink dolphins of Calpitia, are quite rare. They are more of an inshore dolphin, and you get them in the estuaries. And the Calpitia Peninsula area is one of the best places in Sri Lanka to see them. Our ones are of a subspecies called plumbea. They're more gray than pink, but the ones around Hong Kong are very pink. And although we see them in very small numbers, in other parts of the world, sometimes, groups of 1,000 of them can be seen. A lot of the ones you see in Sri Lanka are unfortunately damaged by being struck by boats. So, the sort of human whale or human dolphin conflict is an issue with that particular species. Another species you see when you head out whale watching is the bottlenose dolphin. It's actually been split into two species. So the common one is more oceanic, and the Indo-Pacific is often the one that you encounter when you head out of Mirissa Harbor, because that's an inshore species. The Fraser's is quite rare. You're more likely to see the striped dolphin I will show next. And there are some differences. In the Fraser's, see, these stripes are very thick. It's a sort of very heavily marked dolphin, whereas the stripe, the markings are more delicate, and it's sort of got the stripes sort of bifurcating or splitting into two. Striped dolphins are very aerobatic, and they're a delight if you sort of encounter them and if you find them sort of leaping and performing. And the spinner dolphins are the second most commonly encountered species of Mirissa. Of Calpitia, they are the species you're most likely to see, and there are sometimes amazing aggregations of them. When I first started going out, I was told of these sort of superpods with about 2,000 individuals, and I thought people were just overcounting or exaggerating. But having done several trips, I did come across one of these superpods where I estimated there were genuinely 2,000 individuals in there. And of Calpitia, you often see them spinning, and they are such a joy to watch. You might overlook the pan-tropical spotted dolphin because it's not, when you have a still image like that, they look obviously different, but when they're moving fast, it's sometimes difficult to tell them apart. But they've got this white tip, and they don't have the stripes from the eye to the flipper and the anus. So if you get a photograph, it's quite easy to tell them apart and also look for the spotting. There's no time to go through all the species, the sort of the 26 dolphins, ones of the family Delphinidae. But in this book I've done, A Naturalist's Guide to the Mammals of Sri Lanka, published by John Beaufoy Publishing, you will find I provide an ID guide to, in fact, almost all the mammals, not just the marine mammals. I've only just missed a few species like Omura's whale and Singaraja's shrew. So if you're really interested in learning more and learning to identify marine mammals as well as the other mammals, that's a book you can look at. Just do a quick time check. So 11:20. So okay, sorry, 11:20 UK time. I'm going to have to race through because I don't want to be keeping you guys on for forever. So in the last bit, I'm going to look at surface behavior. So this is something that's sort of unique to marine mammal watching, and it's got its own vocabulary. So think of this almost as an illustrated dictionary as I sort of run through and explain the terms. So breaching is when an animal physically lifts its body out of the water. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking through the slides because of time, but again, as this is being recorded, I guess you all can play it back and hit the pause button. Also online, you'll find I've uploaded various PDFs, and one of the slides had the links. So you can download a PDF that shows a lot of these slides. So the belly up, nobody really knows why they do this. So here's a sperm whale that's sort of the one on the left that's turned upside down, showing the under part of its head. And here's another sperm whale and another one here, just, upright the usual way. So a lot of this behavior, we don't know whether they're playing or whether, it provides a communication function. And another one is this thing called bubbling or trumpeting. So we know, we've probably all done this as a child when you've been given a straw and you've got a milkshake or something else you're drinking, you sort of blow the air into it and you create this bubbling up of the liquid. And parents are like, going, oh, stop doing that, that's bad behavior and so on. But this is a blue whale that I photographed of Mirisa doing that. And this is not just a blow that it suddenly blew and it found itself under the water. These whales were stationary and they repeated this a few times. Now, why are they doing that? That's anybody's guess. So bow riding is when they're riding the bow wave in front of the boat. You need to be careful, maintain speed and not sort of swerve or do anything different that could potentially injure them. They love to do that. They like to catch the pressure wave. So the blow of the spout is when they come up with the surface and they exhale, and then you have this sort of very transient, sort of ephemeral sort of collection of water droplets, a mist. And each species has a characteristic blow, which is useful for identifying. So with the sperm whales, they have a single blowhole to the left and forward pointing. So when you see sperm whale blows at a distance, you can immediately recognize them, very different from the rorqual whales, like the blue whale here, where it's got a tall blow, 3 stories high, and it's very high. But, in windy conditions, it just lasts about a second. So we know about bird waves, where a mixed flock of species can travel together. And similarly, you have cetacean waves. So here's a blue whale traveling with spinner dolphins. And there may be benefits in traveling together. If you're very lucky, you might see a chase. This is, at that time, I mistook this to be humpback whales. But now we know that these were actually blue whales that were engaged in a chase. And this could be part of their sort of breeding behavior. I mean, humpback whales are known to engage in these chases as well. Usually with whales and dolphins, you can't tell the sexes apart unless it's something like the sperm whale, where the bulls are about a third bigger and heavier. Interestingly, with these sperm whales, females are believed to be the ones that develop these calluses atop the dorsal fin, and it could be a secondary sexual characteristic, but as to how it's used, nobody really knows. The term chorus line is used when cetaceans travel in waves, so they sort of appear to be like a chorus line. And flank formation is a very interesting behavior, which is believed to be a courtship behavior. So once when I was off Mirisa, suddenly I had this sort of, and a blue whale surface on one side of the boat, and then another blue whale surfaced on the other side of the boat. And then we also saw this sort of flank formation behavior where this blue whale was not just surfacing, it sort of lifted its tail up and sort of rotated to the side and then gracefully slipped under, and then another blue whale followed suit. So the thinking of the American scientists who observe this behavior is that it's the female that leads it. So it reminds me of the leopards, because quite often you will see the female is the one that goes up to a male and flirts and lifts its tail and wraps it around the male and so on. And here's another picture of that sort of flank formation behavior. So fluking is when a whale just lifts its tail and dives down. as I said, mentioned before, our blue whales do this almost all the time, and so do the sperm whales, and it probably helps them to sort of point down because they need to go down to great depths. Sperm whales also synchronize the diving. They don't just sort of randomly dive at different points in time. And this could be an anti-predator thing that, they're always sort of paired up. The fluke print is just sort of like almost like an oil slick patch you see on the surface when a whale has dived. And they do, lots of stations do something called a head raise, where they will swim up to you and they will, raise their head and look at you. And in the case of a sperm whale, they're also profiling you with sonar when they do that. They're firing this stream of clicks, and they can figure out what they're seeing. And I've always thought that if you're in a boat with children, that they are more likely to be curious and to come up to you. They also sometimes do like a headstand, or what's called a tail extension, where it's not just a smooth diving movement where they fluke up and they go down, but they just seem to hold that and keep that tail suspended for just a bit. Why are they doing that? Again, nobody really knows. Logging is when sperm whales are sort of just floating as if they're like a bunch of logs that the current has caught. And quite often when they're logging, they're resting and they're sleeping. So again, if you find them logging, keep your distance, don't disturb them. Porpoising is when they leap out of the water, and you see the spinner dolphins doing this. It may allow them to travel faster because you don't have the friction of going through the water, but then again, you're expending energy in coming up. You often find things like sperm whales forming defensive walls when they're attacked by orcas. They might go into what's called the Marguerite formation, where they form a circle with their tails facing out so that they can inflict some heavy blows on any predator that comes to them. So the orcas have been recorded a few times now attacking sperm whales off Sri Lanka. And here's an example of one that was, again, worked up into a paper. And orcas have to be careful when they attack sperm whales, because they could actually die if they're hit by a tail that's lashed out. Whales also do these pectoral rolls. Again, are they just having fun? Does it serve a purpose? Nobody really knows. Already talked about the sexual dimorphism. So in baleen whales, the females are bigger, and whereas in the toothed whales, like the sperm whales, it's the other way around. Males are much bigger. And also you can see in mature males, they have lots of white scars on their face because the males have been fighting with each other and leaving tooth marks. Sperm whales also sometimes do this thing called scrumming, which is, I've been lucky enough to have a pot of sperm whales scrumming around my boat. And it's really amazing. It's like, being in a school playground, and when you see all these sort of children, they suddenly start pushing each other and having a bit of a sort of an argy-bargy session. Again, it's probably important for them to bond. They are highly intelligent animals. They are the elephants of the seas. They probably form a very close social links, and this is probably all part of the bonding. They also do this sort of scary thing where they behave like they're a shark, and they go around the boat, they might circle you with this side fluking. And you can almost sort of imagine the music in the Jaws movie playing when they do that. Again, why they do that, nobody really knows. So with some whales, we sort of think of them as solitary. With the sperm whales, we can see that they're social, because you have sometimes superpods or sometimes, small pods. But even with the blue whales, although we think they're solitary, they may be quite social. It's just that for them, social might mean that they're spread, tens or even 100+ kilometers apart, because they can communicate at that distance. So you've got to understand the world an animal lives in, its so-called umwelt, to understand the world from its point of view. So, we might think it's social, but we might think it's solitary, but the blue whales might maybe thinking they're social animals connected, across the oceans and in touch with each other. The spinning is not, it could be something that they do for fun. It could be a way of showing their fitness. It could be that they generate a force of over 4 Gs, and it may have a utilitarian purpose, and that might be to get rid of the remoras which are attached to them. And in these 2 pictures, you can see the remoras being attached, and you can see why they would want to spin and dislodge. The baleen whales, like the blue whales, show what's called a splash guard, which you see here. It just sort of is like an additional protective barrier around the blowhole to prevent water going in. They do something called, whales do something called spy hopping. And these are sperm whales doing it. Dolphins also do that, but they just come up and they raise their head and they look around you. Another area where sort of the engineering field of biomimicry is looking at is these microfolds on the skin to reduce drag. So the swimwear industry has looked at this and developed techniques to make it easier for Olympic swimmers to travel that sort of microsecond faster. There are many places in the world where you can reliably see sperm whales. So Kaikoura in New Zealand is one example, and in the Azores you have small pods. In Kaikoura it tends to be mature bulls. But in terms of seeing pods of 30 sperm whales or more, and your chance of seeing them on a whale watch, Sri Lanka is the best place in the world for seeing a superpod. So in the early years, when I was trying to get the story across to the film crews, I maintained some data, and I defined a superpod as being more than 30. And in those early years, I got some numbers together to show that they are occurring with enough frequency that it might be worthwhile a film crew taking a gamble and coming out to see them. And a number of film crews did, and they got lucky. They came in sort of the right time of the year, around February, March, when these superpods travel off Mirissa, and you find they aggregate either around Kalpitia or around Trincomalee. So in this underwater image, there are 16 sperm whales, and seeing anything more than 3 or 4 sperm whales in the frame of view is quite exceptional anywhere else in the world. And Sri Lanka is the one place where you could have potentially, anything from 50 to 100 sperm whales in the field of view at the same time. So we've talked about, I'm sorry, I seem to have, okay. Okay, the final part, just a couple of slides. So issues and ethics. So in the south of Sri Lanka, as I explained before, we have an area where the continental shelf is close to land, and it's a very rich feeding ground. And if it's a rich feeding ground, it makes sense for the blue whales and other cetaceans to be there. It also means that the fishing craft are there. Unfortunately, the shipping lines have been positioned to run through this area. And as a result of which, what happens is those red dots you're seeing are actually fishing vessels that have been recorded on a scientific survey done by Susanna Calderon and her colleagues at the University of Ruhuna. So what it means is that these container ships are driving through Sri Lanka's, or one of Sri Lanka's most important fishing fleets. There are collisions and fishermen are dying. So I think we should be arguing that in order to save lives, we should move the fishing lines 15 nautical miles south. Many of the shipping industry associations are in favor of this, and they've actually written to the government saying it's very dangerous for these container ships to have to sail through the fishing fleets, especially at night when these are wooden boats, and there are hundreds of these little lights twinkling in the sea around the container ships. And in the picture below, you can see that what also happens when people like you and me go out whale watching. So now we are where the whales are and where the fishing boats are, and you're in this whale watching boat. And sometimes these container ships pass very dangerously close to those fishing, to those whale watching boats. And, it's an accident waiting to happen. And if a container ship hits a whale watching boat, we can see lots of people being killed. And as there's no major cost impact, it makes sense to move those shipping lines further south. I've written an article which I've referenced here, which you can find on the internet, which gives you more information, and you can find the work done by the team from the University of Brunei as well. And finally, on ethical wildlife photography, the way to get good pictures is to bear in mind the welfare of the subject comes first. It really is not important that you get a good picture just to share on social media or for your personal collection. Don't disturb animals. Don't fly drones, because if they can't feed and if they can't rest, it really is a matter of life and death. Because if they don't rest and eat, they succumb to disease and death follows soon after. So let the animals come to you, whether it's leopards or blue whales. If you keep a distance, you find they come close, and then you can observe some amazing behavior, and you can get some good images as well. So, gosh, I hope I haven't taken too much of time. I think I will stop there. And Jonathan, I will hand back to you.
Thank you, sir, for that informative lecture. Now we will move on to a question and answer session. Due to the shortage of time, we have filtered out the questions and we will be answering the most relevant questions. The first question is, for the photographers, what equipment should be used to capture marine mammals? And what is the ideal focal length?
So with a lot of the photography I have used 100 to 400 millimeter zoom. Sometimes I have gone with like a 300 millimeter fixed focal as well. So although things like blue whales are enormous animals, the kind of viewing distance you have and the kind of viewing distance you keep means you really shouldn't get close to them. So you'll find quite often something like, you need something like the equivalent of a 400 millimeter lens. And if you're fortunate enough that your boat crew understands responsible whale watching and they keep the distance, you might find the whale dives and then resurfaces close to you. And then you might be able to actually dial down, instead of having, shooting at the 400 end, you can go to 100 to try and get more of the animal into view. But the other plus of having sort of more power is that if you want to get details, like if you want to photograph the area around the dorsal fin or the tail flukes for a photo ID project, then you have the capability to do that. So with some of the newer lenses, like especially the mirrorless lenses, you might find things like the 500 millimeter and 600 millimeter lenses. They're light enough that you can handhold them and have them steady. So that's another option if it's not a heavy lens, to go for something more powerful.
Thank you, sir. The next question is, what makes Merissa, Culpeper, and Trincomalee ideal whale watching spots?
Sorry, could you repeat that, please?
What makes Merissa, Culpeper, and Trincomalee ideal whale watching spots?
So there are a number of factors. One is that these are areas where the continental shelf comes close to the land. And so that means it's, in terms of the logistics, it's easier for us to get out there. But more importantly, it's what's happening where the deep sea meets the continental shelf. So where where you have the depth change taking place and it's fairly abrupt, you find there's a lot of sort of turbulence taking place at that sort of junction between deep and shallow, which means organic nutrients get brought up to the surface. And that means then the phytoplankton starts to grow and the zooplankton feeds on it, and then the small fish feed on it. So you get this nice big food chain going. So areas where there is turbulence is actually quite good. It means, there's organic matter there and there's food. Whereas further out in the ocean, if you have very deep water and it's very clear, it's actually a desert, because if the water is clear, it means you're not having organic material in it. The other thing is, in places like Mirs and Kalpitia, we have this we have 105 river systems in the country, so they're also bringing food down. So there's sort of onshore organic material which the marine web of life can feed on, being taken onto the ocean. And Trincomalee is especially good because of the submarine canyon. So again, you have deep water coming very close to shore. And again, you have river systems around there which are pumping organic nutrients. And when the monsoons blow, the wave action and the turbulence again results in organic matter being brought up to the surface. So the phytoplankton then gets going, and it is amazing plankton blooms that take place. And these plankton blooms, they can shift from place to place, but they can be so big, they spread over hundreds of square kilometers, and they're actually seen from outer space as well.
Thank you, sir. The next question is, what prompted the southern elephant seal to come to Sri Lanka?
Well, nobody knows for sure, but it's not unusual for animals to disperse. And sometimes, they might just lose their way. So it's this so-called sort of vagrancy. Sometimes an animal could get caught up in a storm and find the currents are pushing it away from where it wants to go. It could get disorientated. So it's like with birds. With birds, it's a little easier to understand vagrancy because quite often it's related to things like storms, but there are other climatic factors that trigger birds as well. So you find, because of climate change, birds that previously would have been flying south might now be more likely to fly east or west. But I think with the southern elephant seals, this is probably just individuals just pushing out. It's sort of, I think, wired into mammals to push out and explore and, go in search of new feeding grounds and territories. And if that is combined with weather events, they might find that, they're well away from where they would normally want to be.
Thank you, sir. The next question is, are there other species other than killer whales that hunt and eat dolphins?
Yes, so things like the false killer whale will also hunt and kill dolphins. So killer whales are actually not the only dolphin species that feeds on other dolphin species. And even things like the pilot whales, given an opportunity, they will attack and kill smaller dolphins.
So, thank you, sir. Do the whales have home ranges, and can they be found within a particular home range?
So that's an interesting question because the general concept of a home range won't apply to a species that has to move around quite a bit. But, with the resident orcas that have been studied, of North America, so you find that, the pods will have certain areas that they're found in. And with orcas in general, so I talked about the 3 ecotypes, But there's also discussion that there are orca populations which are found only in particular parts of the world, and there's sufficient distinctiveness in their sort of genetic makeup that some people say there may be even 3 or 4 species of orcas, although we think of them as one. But but even then, they're more like population distributions. Whereas with most cetaceans, because they're on the move, so you can't really defend a home range. So if you think of the spinner dolphins, they maybe be moving from the western seaboard to the eastern seaboard with the change in the monsoons and where the food is, and they're often traveling great distances. So it doesn't make sense for them to invest and defend a home territory so the way a leopard would. A leopard might have a home range of, say, a core home range of 4 square kilometers or 16 square kilometers if it's a male, and you defend it from intruding males. I think for many species that are on the move, so you find they don't really defend home ranges as such.
Okay, sir. Thank you. The next question is, Mauritius is a fisheries harbor, but what are the practical solutions which can be proposed to avoid such situations?
Okay, so I think there's already sort of a licensing scheme that's in place. I don't know too much of the details, but I mean the basic thing with wildlife tourism is that if something has become phenomenally popular, you sort of have an introduce a system of zoning and limiting numbers. So not in a way that you damage the livelihoods of people, but whether it's Yala or Mirissa, you can say, okay, 10 boats will have a permit for going into this area, and 10 boats will have a permit for going into this area, and so on. And you can do the same in Yala. Yala, the protected area complex is 1,400 square kilometers. So you can introduce zones and you can have permits. And you see this thing being done in India very successfully. And you can use technology now so that you can track each of these licensed boats or vehicles and see the route. You can have software that tells, the boat operator or the vehicle operator or the wildlife authority as to, how many times a week or a month a driver has violated the permit system. So that combined with education and making people understand that it's a better experience for both the animals and the tourists if it's done in a managed and responsible way, you can balance it. So there won't be a conflict with the fishing vessels because they go out to fish and they do their thing. Of course, they do let their friends who are running whale watching boats if they see a boat. Many times I've been out at sea and I've sort of, in the early years, I would go up to the fishing boats and ask them if they had seen a whale, and they would say no, and they would have some vague recollection of, somebody having seen a whale in the deep, was it 2 months ago or 3 months ago, very vague, hazy recollections because, people weren't really looking for whales. And then my boat would pull away, and then I would see like a blue whale surfacing next to the boat of the fisherman whom I'd been speaking to, and they don't even notice it because at that time nobody paid attention. And so the whales are used to the fishing fleets. So the fishing fleets don't disturb them. It's just that when lots of boats go after a whale, and sometimes it's not deliberate, sometimes it just because they come from different directions, they end up encircling the whale, and with all the engine noise that must disturb the whale, and they might go away. Sometimes they form a nice line on one side of the whale, and the whales might continue to feed for an hour or two without being disturbed. So I think it's a combination of education and having a sensible system where boats are licensed and they're given a choice of zones and so on.
Thank you, sir. Are there any reliable spots in Sri Lanka where you can see a dugong?
Well, nothing that is, I would say, reliable. So the area sort of, the Mana Basin, so from sort of the tip of Kalpita Peninsula and running along the shore to sort of past Vilpattu, that area is, and up to Mana, that's the area that people have seen dugongs. I know Ranil Nanak was doing a Dilma project funded study on the dugongs. And I guess if you look online, if Ranil has been able to publish anything yet, you might find more data. There are people in India who've been studying the dugongs, and there are papers published. But at the moment, there isn't an area where you have a sufficiently good encounter rate. And also remember what I was saying, that they are fairly unobtrusive. So it's not like the blue whales, if you're close to them, you can actually hear them blow. But you're not relying on your ears. You just see this big plume, which is plume of water, which is 3 stories high. So you can see the blue whales from sometimes kilometer or 2 kilometers away. Whereas with the dugongs, you will need very calm surface conditions to be able to, just pick up that little disturbance when they come up and blow.
Thank you, sir. Is there any particular reason as to why sperm whales gather off the coast of Sri Lanka?
So the great gatherings, they could be related to the breeding cycle, and it could be similar to what we have with the elephant gathering in Mineria and Kaudulla. So if you're watching the elephants, you see how these sort of big herds sort of coalesce to feed. So there's so it provides good feeding, and there's water. So that's one of the basic needs being met. Then you also find the bull elephants come, and then they're literally sort of sniffing out the females. So it allows the males and the females to meet and mate. So reproduction is another key thing. And then bear in mind, these are intelligent mammals, and they're very social mammals. So and they probably need this social interaction as well. So again, with the sperm whales, that these things could be key drivers. So there's, seasonally there may be good feeding, so it makes sense for these nursery schools or breeding schools to coalesce. They probably need that social interaction because they are intelligent, sentient beings. And then it also allows an opportunity for the males that are in breeding condition to come and find prospective mates. So that makes it easy. And, because these animals can be spread quite widely across the ocean. So rather than it being a hit and miss thing as to whether a male in prime breeding condition finds a female, if they have, developed this culture where they come to these sort of equatorial latitudes, that makes it easier as well. So I think it's a similar thing with what's going on with the sperm whales and the elephant gathering.
So thank you, sir. Now coming to the last question. Are there any research efforts in Sri Lanka relating to bioacoustics which regard whales and dolphins? And also to add to that question, how do marine mammals communicate?
Yeah, so marine mammals communicate using acoustics, so which are often at a frequency that we can't hear. And there's a lot of work being done all over the world to have passive recording devices. So and you sort of you periodically download the data, and you have software that works out which species it is. And this is often, the only possible way to study mammals that live most of their lives underwater. So there is work being done. I believe the University of Ruhuna team are looking at using acoustic methods. And I've seen, I think on social media, I've seen a PhD being advertised for somebody who will participate, for a candidate who would be interested in getting involved in acoustic studies. So if anybody in this audience is particularly interested, I would suggest you get in touch. I think it's Pradeep Kumara from the University of Ruina who's been doing some of these studies. But if you search social media, I'm sure you will find the Sri Lankan scientists who are doing the work. Then I know people like Ranil Nanekara has been using underwater microphones to record and write up his sort of data as well, based on what he's been picking up. And there may be others doing more work on this area as well.
We come to the end of yet another very successful and knowledge-filled webinar. We cordially thank Mr. Gehan for spending his valuable time to impart his vast knowledge and enlighten us all on the marine mammals of Sri Lanka. We are humbled and extremely honored to have had him speak to us today. I hope that everyone joining gained much knowledge from this awesome lecture. I would like to thank DMO and Jeep Sri Lanka for sponsoring this webinar. We are extremely grateful for their continuous support and generous contribution toward our webinars. We could not have done it without them. I would also like to sincerely thank the ICT Society for live streaming our webinars on YouTube. If you wish to watch the recording of the lecture, it has been uploaded onto the STC Mount YouTube channel. Last but not least, I would like to thank the audience for participating in this event. We hope that you enjoyed today's session and would join us in our future webinars. Stay safe and have a blessed week. Thank you.
Thank you again for everybody for joining in.
Thank you, sir.